Respect constitutes the foundation of every healthy relationship, and its absence reveals character deficiencies that cannot be hidden regardless of setting or circumstance. What transpired on the Family Feud stage in April 2025 would demonstrate how patterns of disrespect and subordination that exist in private relationships become unmistakably clear when displayed in public contexts, and how intervention from those with authority and moral clarity can interrupt harmful dynamics and provide opportunities for reflection and potential change. Steve Harvey had welcomed thousands of families throughout his extensive tenure as host, observing various relationship dynamics and interpersonal patterns. However, the behavior he would witness from one contestant toward his spouse would cross boundaries of acceptable conduct in such obvious ways that silence would constitute complicity and intervention would become moral imperative. The incident serves as a powerful illustration that treating a spouse as subordinate rather than equal represents fundamental violation of partnership principles, and that such treatment deserves immediate confrontation, regardless of how normalized it may have become within the relationship itself. On this particular afternoon, one man's treatment of his wife as a servant rather than a partner would collide with Steve Harvey's commitment to dignity and mutual respect in relationships, resulting in an intervention that would force examination of patterns that had persisted unchallenged for years. Before exploring this significant sequence of events that demonstrates the importance of recognizing and confronting disrespectful treatment in relationships, and the courage required to intervene when witnessing someone being treated as inferior rather than equal, please take a moment to support our channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to ensure you receive these important Family Feud moments that provide valuable lessons about mutual respect, partnership equality, and the responsibility to speak up when witnessing unacceptable treatment of others. The Harrison family from Nashville, Tennessee entered the Family Feud stage with dynamics that immediately registered as concerning to experienced production staff. Leading the group was Robert Harrison, a 51-year-old financial consultant whose authoritative demeanor and commanding presence suggested someone accustomed to exercising control in all contexts. Beside him stood his wife of 23 years, Linda Harrison, a quiet woman whose deferential body language and careful attention to Robert's preferences suggested a relationship characterized by subordination rather than partnership. Their family team included Robert's colleague James, Linda's cousin Karen, and their adult daughter Jessica, creating a composition that would bear witness to behavior patterns that became increasingly problematic as the taping progressed. Steve Harvey conducted the standard pre-game conversation with his characteristic warmth and humor, asking about the family's background and their reasons for appearing on the show. Robert dominated the interaction completely, describing their life in Nashville while Linda stood silently beside him. When Steve directed questions specifically to Linda, attempting to include her in the conversation, Robert frequently interrupted to answer on her behalf or to correct and elaborate on her responses. The dynamic suggested that Robert viewed himself as the family spokesperson and decision-maker while Linda's role was to support and defer rather than to contribute independently. The game commenced with standard competitive energy. The Harrison family faced the Martinez family from Phoenix, and the early rounds demonstrated Robert's aggressive approach to team leadership. However, what became increasingly apparent was that Robert's interactions with Linda resembled those of an employer directing an employee or master directing a servant rather than a husband partnering with an equal spouse. He issued instructions to Linda about where to stand, when to speak, and how to respond. He dismissed her suggestions about strategy without consideration. He treated her contributions as subordinate to his own and expected immediate compliance with his directions without question or discussion. During the second round, when Linda was called to provide an answer, Robert interrupted before she could speak to tell her what response to give. When she hesitated, attempting to formulate her own answer, Robert became visibly impatient and repeated his instruction more firmly. Linda complied with his direction, providing the answer Robert had instructed rather than offering her own judgment. The interaction was brief but revealing. demonstrating a pattern of control and subordination that extended beyond game strategy into fundamental relationship dynamics. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that what they were witnessing represented something more troubling than typical competitive family interaction. Understanding the full significance of what would unfold requires comprehensive knowledge of the Harrison marriage and the patterns of control and subordination that had characterized Robert's treatment of Linda throughout their 23-year relationship. Robert and Linda had met 25 years earlier when both attended a professional conference in Atlanta. Robert was establishing himself as a financial consultant with aspirations of building a successful practice, serving high-net-worth clients. Linda worked as an executive assistant at a major corporation, a position that required organizational skills and professional competence, but that Robert characterized as support work rather than substantive professional contribution. Their courtship had been characterized by Robert's dominant personality and Linda's accommodating nature. Early patterns established during dating had included Robert making decisions about their activities without consulting Linda's preferences, Robert criticizing Linda's choices and judgments while expecting her to defer to his superior knowledge, and Robert treating Linda's primary role as supporting his career and managing domestic responsibilities, while his role was to make important decisions and provide financial support. Friends had noted the imbalance, but had rationalized it as traditional gender roles, rather than recognizing it as controlling behavior that established hierarchy rather than partnership. The marriage that followed had reinforced and intensified these patterns. Robert built a successful financial consulting practice that generated substantial income and professional status. Linda left her corporate position after their marriage at Robert's insistence, with the expectation that she would manage their household, support Robert's career through entertaining clients and attending professional events, and raise their children. However, Robert's treatment of Linda's domestic contributions resembled an employer's expectations of household staff rather than a partner's appreciation of essential work. He issued detailed instructions about household management, criticized Linda's performance of domestic tasks, and treated her role as service provision rather than as equal contribution to their shared life. Over 23 years, this dynamic had become so normalized within their relationship that Linda no longer questioned whether it was appropriate or healthy. She had internalized Robert's characterization of their roles as natural and proper, accepting that his professional work was more valuable than her domestic contributions and that his judgment was superior to hers in most contexts. She had learned to anticipate Robert's preferences and expectations, to minimize her own needs and desires, and to present herself as supportive and deferential in all situations. The relationship functioned efficiently from Robert's perspective because Linda had been conditioned to provide seamless service and support without requiring acknowledgement or reciprocal consideration. The Family Feud appearance had been Robert's decision, made without significant consultation with Linda about her interest or comfort with television appearance. He had assembled a family team and informed Linda that she would participate, providing her with instructions about appropriate behavior and expectations for her performance. Linda had agreed without question, as she had learned to agree with Robert's decisions throughout their marriage. She had not considered refusing or expressing preference about the situation, because such assertion would have been inconsistent with her learned role of compliance and support. What Linda did not fully recognize was that the pattern of subordination and service that characterized her relationship with Robert was not universal or inevitable, but rather represented Robert's specific choices about how to structure their marriage in ways that served his interests and reinforced his sense of superiority and control. She had limited exposure to alternative relationship models because Robert controlled their social connections and activities, ensuring that they primarily associated with people who shared or accepted traditional hierarchical views of marriage. The public nature of the Family Feud appearance would provide Linda with external perspectives on her relationship that would begin to create cognitive dissonance with her internalized beliefs about appropriate marital dynamics. Steve Harvey, meanwhile, had developed clear perspectives through his various platforms about healthy relationships requiring mutual respect, partnership rather than hierarchy, and reciprocal consideration rather than one-sided service. He had been consistent in his messaging that successful marriages involve treating spouses as equals deserving respect and agency, and that relationships characterized by subordination and control represented distortions of partnership principles. The collision between Robert's normalized pattern of treating Linda as a servant and Steve's commitment to relationship equality would create circumstances requiring direct intervention. The game continued with both families demonstrating competitive performance. The Harrison family had taken a slight lead, and Robert appeared pleased with their progress. However, his treatment of Linda became increasingly problematic as the rounds progressed. During transitions between questions, Robert issued instructions to Linda about her posture, her facial expressions, and her positioning on stage. He treated these directives as reasonable guidance rather than controlling micromanagement, apparently unaware that his behavior was being perceived by studio audience members and production staff as inappropriately domineering. When the game reached a round where Linda was positioned at the buzzer for a face-off question, Robert called out instructions to her about strategy and timing before Steve even asked the question. Linda appeared to be concentrating on following Robert's directions rather than preparing to answer based on her own judgment. The opposing family member at the buzzer seemed uncomfortable with the dynamic, glancing between Linda and Robert with an expression suggesting recognition that something was wrong with the interaction pattern. Steve Harvey asked the face-off question, which requested contestants to name something people forget to do before going on vacation. Linda hesitated, appearing uncertain whether to answer based on her own thinking or to wait for Robert's direction. Robert called out from his position with the family team, instructing Linda to answer, "Stop the mail." Linda repeated the answer as instructed, and it appeared on the board as the number 3 response. However, the Harrison family did not win control of the board, and play passed to the opposing family. During this transition, Steve approached Linda and asked whether she was enjoying the experience. The question was delivered with gentle concern, suggesting that Steve had observed the controlling dynamic and was checking on Linda's well-being. Linda responded with practiced positivity, stating that she was having a wonderful time and was grateful for the opportunity to support her family's participation. The response was delivered with a smile that appeared genuine, but that also suggested the automatic nature of her deferential presentation rather than authentic expression of her actual feelings. As subsequent rounds progressed, Robert's treatment of Linda escalated in ways that made the service dynamic unmistakable. When Linda provided an answer that did not appear on the survey board, Robert criticized her publicly for not following his earlier instruction to answer differently. When she successfully provided a correct answer, Robert claimed credit for having prepared her properly rather than acknowledging her independent contribution. When she stood in a location that Robert deemed suboptimal for camera positioning, he directed her to move with a tone and manner that resembled ordering household staff rather than making a polite suggestion to a spouse. The pattern culminated in a moment during the 4th round that crystallized the problematic dynamic in ways that could not be ignored or rationalized. The Harrison family had control of the board and was working to provide the remaining answers needed to win the round. When it was Linda's turn to answer, Robert stepped forward and handed her a bottle of water that she had not requested, stating that she looked thirsty and instructing her to drink before answering. The gesture might have appeared considerate in isolation, but the manner of its delivery, the assumption of knowing Linda's needs better than she knew them herself, the instruction rather than offer, the public display of his role as provider and director of her behavior, combined with the accumulated pattern of controlling behavior to create an unmistakable impression of subordination rather than partnership. Steve Harvey paused the game and addressed Robert directly, stating that he had noticed throughout the taping that Robert treated Linda more like an employee or servant than like a spouse and equal partner. He explained that the constant directions, the speaking on her behalf, the public criticism, and the general expectation of deference and compliance created dynamics that were concerning and inappropriate. He suggested that Linda was fully capable of standing, speaking, and making decisions without Robert's constant management, and that treating a spouse as requiring such management suggested problematic assumptions about equality and respect. Robert's response revealed the depth of his lack of awareness about how his behavior appeared to external observers. He stated that he was simply being helpful and supportive, that Linda appreciated his guidance and direction, and that Steve was misinterpreting considerate assistance as controlling behavior. He suggested that he knew Linda well enough to anticipate her needs, and that providing such anticipatory service represented good husband behavior rather than inappropriate control. The explanation demonstrated such fundamental misunderstanding of partnership versus service dynamics that several audience members reacted with audible expressions of disagreement. Steve challenged Robert's characterization directly, asking whether Linda had been consulted about her preferences for how much direction and management she wanted, or whether Robert had simply assumed that providing constant instruction served her interests. He pointed out that truly supportive behavior involved respecting a partner's autonomy and capability rather than treating them as requiring management. He noted that Robert's treatment of Linda suggested that he viewed himself as superior and Linda as subordinate, and that such hierarchy contradicted fundamental principles of marital partnership and mutual respect. The confrontation between Steve and Robert created significant tension on the Family Feud stage. Robert appeared genuinely confused by Steve's characterization of his behavior as problematic, suggesting the extent to which he had normalized treating Linda as subordinate and had surrounded himself with people who accepted or reinforced this dynamic rather than challenging it. He attempted to defend himself by stating that Linda had never complained about his helpfulness and that she seemed happy with their relationship arrangement. He suggested that Steve was imposing modern sensibilities about gender equality onto a traditional marriage that functioned well by its own standards. Steve's response addressed this justification with directness and moral clarity. He stated that the absence of complaint did not necessarily indicate satisfaction or consent, particularly when one partner had been conditioned over many years to accept subordination as normal and to suppress preferences that contradicted the dominant partner's expectations. He explained that truly happy and healthy relationships were characterized by both partners feeling free to express preferences, make independent decisions, and contribute based on their own judgment rather than by one partner constantly managing and directing the other's behavior. Steve turned to address Linda directly, asking her whether she enjoyed being given constant instructions and directions by Robert, or whether she would prefer to make more decisions independently without his management. The question created a moment of profound tension because it required Linda to articulate preferences that she had been conditioned to suppress, and to do so publicly in front of Robert and hundreds of witnesses. Linda's initial response was to defer, stating that Robert was very knowledgeable and that his guidance was usually helpful. However, Steve gently persisted, asking specifically whether Linda would like to answer Family Feud questions based on her own thinking without Robert telling her what to say. The question was simple but powerful because it created space for Linda to acknowledge preferences that contradicted the subordinate role she had accepted for more than 2 decades. After a long pause during which the studio remained completely silent, Linda responded quietly that she would actually like to try answering questions on her own without Robert's instructions. The acknowledgement was tentative and delivered with visible nervousness about contradicting Robert's established pattern of control, but it represented the first small assertion of independent preference that Linda had expressed publicly in many years. Robert's reaction to Linda's statement revealed the controlling nature of his behavior with unmistakable clarity. Rather than accepting Linda's expressed preference or acknowledging her right to make such decisions, he responded with irritation and dismissiveness. He stated that Linda was simply being influenced by Steve's questions and that she did not actually want to answer without his helpful guidance. He suggested that Linda would make mistakes without his direction and that the family's chances of winning would be compromised if he stopped providing strategic instruction. The response demonstrated such profound disrespect for Linda's autonomy and such clear prioritization of winning the game over respecting his wife's expressed preferences that the studio audience reacted with obvious disapproval. Steve intervened again, this time with increased firmness and clarity about the unacceptability of Robert's behavior. He stated that Linda had just expressed a clear preference to answer questions independently, and that Robert's immediate dismissal of her stated desire revealed exactly the problematic dynamic that had been apparent throughout the taping. He explained that respecting a partner meant honoring their expressed preferences, even when those preferences differed from one's own assumptions or created minor inconveniences. He pointed out that Robert's concern about winning the game taking precedence over respecting Linda's autonomy demonstrated seriously distorted priorities about what mattered in relationships. Steve made a decision to structure the remainder of the game in a manner that would provide Linda with opportunities to participate independently without Robert's interference. He established a rule that for the remaining rounds, Robert would not be permitted to provide instructions or directions to Linda, and that she would answer questions based solely on her own judgment. He explained that this modification was being implemented not to punish Robert, but rather to create space for Linda to experience participating as an independent agent rather than as a directed subordinate, and to allow the family team and audience to see how Linda performed when given respect and autonomy. Robert objected strenuously to this modification, arguing that Steve was overstepping his authority as host and imposing artificial constraints that would disadvantage their family team. He stated that his instructions to Linda were based on superior knowledge and strategy, and that preventing him from providing guidance would harm their competitive position. The objection revealed that Robert's primary concern remained winning the game rather than examining the relationship dynamics that Steve was attempting to address, and that he continued to view his right to manage Linda's behavior as more important than her expressed preference for autonomy. Steve's response was definitive. He stated that the modification would be implemented regardless of Robert's objections, that Family Feud would not provide a platform for relationship dynamics that involved one partner controlling and managing another partner like household staff, and that Robert could either accept these terms or the family could forfeit their participation. He made clear that this was not subject to negotiation or discussion, and that the values of respect and autonomy took precedence over competitive considerations or Robert's preferences about how the game should proceed. The remainder of the game proceeded under the modified rules that prevented Robert from directing Linda's participation. The change in dynamic was immediately apparent and remarkably instructive. Without Robert's constant management, Linda demonstrated perfectly adequate judgment and capability. She answered questions thoughtfully, contributed strategic suggestions to the family team, and participated with growing confidence as she experienced being treated as an autonomous adult rather than as a subordinate requiring direction. The Harrison family continued to perform competitively, demonstrating that Robert's controlling behavior had been unnecessary for success and had been motivated by his need for control rather than by Linda's actual need for management. The episode, when it eventually aired with editing that preserved the essential intervention while managing the sensitive relationship dynamics, sparked extensive national conversation about control and subordination in marriages, the normalization of treating spouses as servants rather than equals, and the responsibility of those who witness such dynamics to speak up rather than remain silent. The incident resonated particularly strongly with women who recognized elements of their own relationships in Linda's deferential behavior, and with men who began questioning whether their own helpful guidance might actually constitute inappropriate management and control. Steve Harvey addressed the incident extensively across his various platforms, using it as a teaching moment about the difference between supportive partnership and controlling subordination. He explained that healthy relationships involve treating spouses as equals capable of making their own decisions rather than as subordinates requiring management. He emphasized that even when control was framed as helpfulness or guidance, it remained problematic if it was imposed rather than requested, and if it prevented a partner from exercising autonomous judgment and decision-making. Linda Harrison faced the challenging task of processing what had occurred during the Family Feud taping and determining how to address patterns in her marriage that she had normalized for more than 2 decades, but that external observers had identified as problematic. The public nature of Steve's intervention created immediate tension in her relationship with Robert, who was angry about being called out on national television and who blamed Steve for creating conflict where none had existed. However, the experience also provided Linda with external validation that her occasional discomfort with Robert's controlling behavior had been justified rather than ungrateful or oversensitive as Robert had characterized it. Linda began attending counseling to process the Family Feud experience and to examine her relationship dynamics from new perspectives. The therapist helped Linda recognize that the pattern of subordination and service in her marriage was not inevitable or normal, but rather represented specific choices about relationship structure that had served Robert's interests while requiring Linda to suppress her own preferences and autonomy. The recognition created significant cognitive dissonance as Linda reconciled her internalized beliefs about proper marital roles with new awareness that alternative relationship models involved greater equality and mutual respect. Robert experienced social consequences as friends and colleagues who viewed the Family Feud episode or heard about the incident expressed discomfort with his treatment of Linda and questioned whether someone who managed his wife so overtly would treat professional colleagues and subordinates with appropriate respect. Several clients mentioned the incident during meetings, creating awkward moments where Robert had to address public perceptions of his character and relationship values. His adult daughter Jessica, who had witnessed the dynamic on the Family Feud stage, began her own therapy process to examine how growing up in a household where her mother was treated as subordinate had affected her understanding of relationships and gender dynamics. 6 months following the Family Feud incident, Linda and Robert were engaged in marriage counseling at Linda's insistence and with Robert's reluctant participation. The therapy process was difficult because it required Robert to examine behaviors and assumptions that he had never questioned and to recognize that what he had characterized as helpful guidance actually constituted controlling micromanagement. The counselor worked with both partners to establish more balanced relationship dynamics that honored Linda's autonomy while addressing Robert's anxiety about relinquishing control. Progress was slow and uneven, with Robert frequently reverting to directive behavior before catching himself and attempting different approaches. The marriage counseling process revealed that Robert's need to control Linda stemmed from deeper insecurities about his own worth and competence. Managing Linda's behavior provided him with constant validation of his superior knowledge and capability, and allowing her to function independently threatened this source of self-esteem. The counselor helped Robert understand that true partnership required tolerating uncertainty about outcomes and trusting that Linda's independent judgments would be adequate even when they differed from his own preferences. She helped Linda practice asserting preferences and making decisions independently, working through the anxiety that arose when she contradicted Robert's expectations. 1 year after the Family Feud intervention, the Harrison marriage had undergone significant transformation, though the process remained ongoing. Robert had made genuine efforts to reduce his controlling behavior and to treat Linda with greater respect for her autonomy and capability. He continued to struggle with impulses to manage and direct her behavior, but he had developed awareness of these patterns and was working to interrupt them. Linda had become more comfortable expressing preferences and making independent decisions, though she still experienced anxiety when contradicting Robert and sometimes reverted to deferential patterns during stressful periods. Linda became involved in support organizations for women in controlling relationships, finding value in sharing her experience and in hearing from others who had normalized subordination until external intervention helped them recognize problematic patterns. She emphasized in her advocacy work that controlling behavior often presented itself as helpfulness and that distinguishing appropriate support from inappropriate management required examining whether the behavior honored the partner's autonomy or undermined it. She credited Steve Harvey's intervention on Family Feud as the catalyst that enabled her to begin questioning relationship dynamics she had accepted as normal for more than 2 decades. 3 years following the Family Feud incident, Linda had made substantial progress in developing independent identity and asserting preferences that reflected her authentic desires rather than Robert's expectations. She had returned to professional work, taking a position that utilized her organizational and management skills while providing income and professional identity separate from her domestic role. She had established friendships and activities that she selected based on her own interests rather than Robert's approval. She maintained her marriage to Robert, but on terms that involved greater equality and mutual respect than had characterized their previous 23 years together. Robert experienced ongoing challenges in adjusting to a marriage structure that required him to relinquish control and to treat Linda as an equal partner rather than as a subordinate. The process had forced him to examine fundamental assumptions about gender power and relationships that he had never questioned. He engaged in individual therapy in addition to marriage counseling, working to develop self-esteem based on his actual accomplishments rather than on his ability to manage and direct his wife's behavior. His progress was genuine but difficult, as changing patterns that had been reinforced for more than 2 decades required sustained effort and willingness to tolerate discomfort. 5 years after that remarkable Family Feud taping, when Steve Harvey intervened to interrupt Robert's treatment of Linda as a servant rather than a partner, the incident remained a significant cultural reference point in discussions about control in relationships and the importance of distinguishing supportive partnership from managing subordination. Marriage counselors and relationship educators use the case as an illustration of how controlling behavior often presents itself as helpfulness and how external intervention can provide those in subordinate positions with validation necessary to begin questioning normalized patterns. Steve Harvey continued to reference the Harrison family incident for years as an example of how patterns of disrespect and control in relationships often become so normalized that those involved no longer recognize them as problematic until external observers provide alternative perspectives. He used the situation to encourage his audiences to examine their own relationships for signs of imbalance and to consider whether their helpful guidance might actually constitute inappropriate management that undermines a partner's autonomy and agency. The relationship between Steve and Linda continued through periodic communication facilitated by the production team. He celebrated her progress in developing greater independence and equality in her marriage, and he occasionally featured her on his programs to discuss her experience and the resources available for people in controlling relationships. He maintained that his intervention on Family Feud represented important use of his platform to interrupt harmful dynamics and to model the importance of speaking up when witnessing someone being treated as subordinate rather than as an equal partner deserving respect and autonomy. 10 years after the Family Feud taping, when Robert Harrison treated Linda like a maid until Steve Harvey intervened, the incident continued to serve as a powerful example of how controlling behavior in relationships often presents as helpfulness and how external intervention can provide necessary perspective for recognizing that subordination is neither normal nor acceptable. Documentary filmmakers examined the case as part of broader explorations of control in marriage and the various subtle mechanisms through which one partner's autonomy becomes systematically undermined while being framed as supportive guidance. Linda had established herself as a relationship educator specializing in helping women recognize controlling behavior that presents itself as helpfulness and develop strategies for asserting autonomy within existing relationships or for safely exiting relationships where control cannot be modified. She maintained her marriage to Robert, which had been transformed through sustained therapeutic work into a partnership characterized by greater equality and mutual respect than their original dynamic. She spoke publicly about her experience when opportunities arose to help others, crediting Steve Harvey's intervention as the moment when external reality interrupted decades of normalization and created space for questioning whether the relationship structure she had accepted actually served her well-being. Robert had undergone genuine transformation in his understanding of relationships and partnership, though he acknowledged that controlling impulses remained a lifelong challenge requiring ongoing self-awareness and deliberate effort to interrupt. He participated in men's groups focused on healthy masculinity and respectful relationships, sharing his experience as an example of how traditional assumptions about gender roles and male authority could distort partnership into hierarchy. He maintained that the Family Feud intervention, while initially experienced as humiliating public criticism, had ultimately provided him with opportunity to examine and modify behavior patterns that had been harmful despite his lack of conscious intention to cause harm. The story of Robert and Linda Harrison serves as a compelling testament to how controlling behavior in relationships often presents itself as helpfulness and support, making it difficult for those involved to recognize subordination until external intervention provides alternative perspectives. It demonstrates that treating a spouse as requiring constant management and direction represents fundamental disrespect for their autonomy and capability, regardless of how such treatment is framed or rationalized. It illustrates that intervention from those who witness problematic dynamics can provide both the subordinate partner and the controlling partner with opportunities to recognize patterns that had been normalized and to consider whether changes might create healthier and more balanced relationships. The case provides important lessons about distinguishing genuine support from controlling management, recognizing that absence of complaint does not necessarily indicate satisfaction when one partner has been conditioned to suppress preferences, and understanding that healthy relationships require treating partners as equals capable of autonomous judgment rather than as subordinates requiring direction. It reminds us that those who witness concerning relationship dynamics have responsibility to speak up rather than remain silent, and that such intervention, while potentially creating discomfort, can provide opportunities for growth and change that benefit all parties involved. If this account has provided valuable insight into the dynamics of control in relationships that presents as helpfulness, the importance of distinguishing supportive partnership from managing subordination, and the potential for intervention to create opportunities for recognizing and modifying problematic patterns, please take a moment to support our channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to ensure you receive additional Family Feud moments and compelling narratives that demonstrate the importance of mutual respect in relationships, the responsibility to interrupt harmful dynamics when witnessed, and the various ways that external perspective can help those in controlling relationships recognize that subordination is neither normal nor necessary, and that partnership based on equality and mutual respect represents achievable alternative to hierarchy and control.